Okay. Oh, okay. Well, we'll see. We are now officially live.
Woohoo.
Um, and I don't think we have anybody. No, we don't have anybody watching us yet. We
Perfect.
had up to 5 people on the
Whoa.
last stream at one time. I know, which was kind of like a some sort of record. Um, yeah, and actually like some back and forth, some with people in the chat. It was fun. Um, though I I kind of dropped the ball on advertising this one. So may not have as many people, but really this is the excuse to make some cheap video content for me to mess around with. Um,
That's
so yeah. Um, uh, we just start off with some introductions briefly. So I'll start and then we can just go around. My name is Josh Davis. I am the content manager for Grassroots Economic Organizing. Welcome to our monthly live stream. Matt, we'll go next.
Yeah, I'm Matt Noyes, and I'm a member of the Grassroots Economic Organizing Collective, and living here in Colorado, doing some various types of work. Most recently, landscaping and farming, in addition to some translating and other stuff. How about any?
Sure, yeah. I am a GEO fangirl. I admire a lot of what GEO puts out, love the newsletter. I'm working at Sustainability Solutions Group and Young Agrarians, both in sort of a co-op capacity. And excited to be here.
Great. Well, happy VE Day to everybody. I don't know if anybody is a history nerd, but this is the day in 1945 on which the Nazis were defeated in Europe, end of the war over there. So important day for fighting fascism today. So I to start things out here, there's something that's been on my mind that comes up like every time I hear somebody use a particular phrase, it comes up, fairly relatively often. Something like goes off in my brain, and I go through this rant every time I hear this phrase. So I've thought like I just need to get this out and say it, like get it recorded so I can just like stop thinking it every time somebody says this, and maybe it'll have some effect. So the phrase in question is low skill labor, low skilled work. I despise this term because every time somebody uses that term, what I think is all you're showing is that you do not understand that job. You don't know what is involved in that work. And I say this as somebody who has done a lot of jobs that get labeled as low skilled. And I've done them enough to know that they're not low skilled. There's plenty of skills involved. So to take one example, and this is, when I really realized when I was like in my early 20s, or maybe middle 20s, working at a bakery, and got to work with a janitor there named Joe. And Joe was a high skilled janitor, a very high skilled janitor. So like, let me tell you what is involved with being a high skilled janitor, right? You're keeping a facility clean. It's specifically like a food production facility in this case. You have to know what you're cleaning on a daily basis, what you're cleaning on a weekly basis, what needs to be cleaned twice during a shift, what needs to be done once a month, what's, when everybody is at different stations doing work so you can be in different places, not getting in their way. You have to have all of this like super systematized, and as well as being like very efficient with just like your physical motions, being able to get stuff done in a very efficient manner, and just being physically fit, which again, something that in jobs we don't count as a skill for some reason, like being strong and having good endurance. If you're a football player, if you're a soccer player, right, that's a skill. You're a skilled athlete because you're strong and it can go forever. If you have those exact same skills in the labor market, all of a sudden you're a low skill worker. So Joe was like super on the ball and was way higher skilled of a worker than plenty of people who work behind desks, right? It's possible to do any job, this is my thing, in a low skilled way or in a high skilled way. And I have known, I'm sure we all know, plenty of people who, have
Hey Josh.
positions. Yes. Sorry.
I just wanted to sorry, I just wanted to make sure that one issue was solved. So my audio wasn't coming through. I think I solved it. But Colin says there's feedback happening. He's not sure who it's from. I'm guessing it's Matt. I think that'll solve it, but we'll see. I'll let you know. Keep talking, and if there's any issues, I'll bring it up.
All right. So so my rant is for nothing, but that's okay. But yeah, I mean, any job can be done in a high skilled manner and a low skilled manner, and the like concept that particular jobs like are only low skilled is just, to me, is insulting. And I've known plenty of people in management positions who are pretty low skilled managers, right? Like just because you have a degree, just because you have a title, doesn't mean that you necessarily are great at your job. And Joe, as a janitor, like I don't think there's anybody in the world that is more skilled than he is at his job. And there are plenty of people making a lot more money there's lots of people who are more skilled at their job than they are. So I would really prefer that we just stop using the term low skilled labor, because I think it's a complete misnomer. It's manual labor by and large is what we're talking about. And it's not, and a part, yes. And it's even something like ditch digging, right? Like, I don't know if you've ever done any ditch digging or digging holes. That's like the epitome of low skilled labor, right? Oh, you just take a shovel, you just dig a hole. Like, what's the big deal? Like, okay, how many ditches have you dug? I've dug a few. Okay, here you go. Here's 100 yard stretch that we need to dig a ditch in, and it's got to have like a 2% grade, right? Because the water's got to go down, and here's your shovel, and it's got to be like straight, and it's got to look good, and also hopefully you're not going to have you've done this a whole bunch, so you're going to have blisters on your hands like within the first 5 minutes. So there's a lot of skills involved in even something like that. So I just, this is my little rant of saying like, okay, let's stop using this term low skilled labor. That's something that I think capitalists came up with to, justify underpaying particular people. So we should evict it from our vocabulary in the worker co-op movement. That's my thing. Mic drop. All right.
Hey, it wasn't for nothing. Colin was saying that the he could still hear everything, but it was just something. If you raise the volume enough, then it becomes more audible. But yeah, I think that was part of the argument 100 years ago about the whole craft unionism and industrial unionism, that they're just like divisions that are meant to divide the working classes from being able to work together. But then there's probably also that hierarchy part. Anytime I hear that, I feel like it's usually coming from crummy people who get a rise or like get a sense of like superiority over others. Using that term low skill. I don't think I've ever used that term.
Matt, Emmy, do you guys hear this? I mean, I know I've heard it in worker co-op things from people I respect. It's just.
I might have used it too. And I think I use it as like this is an opportunity for someone who does like is new to working and can enter. Like I'm using it as a low barrier to entry, maybe type phrase. I don't, yeah, I didn't, I think like what you're talking about, Josh, is like for me, what's coming through is like the way that using that phrase demeans a certain set of skills or diminishes like an opportunity to celebrate like somebody mastering a set of skills. So like you could be like a highly, I don't know. And I also struggle with this too, like especially right now, even in my job right now, there are moments where I feel like I'm not doing a good job. And I talk often about not being skilled in being able to deliver in my position. But yeah, so I find the high and low demarcation challenging. I think I maybe I use like hard and soft more often to describe the differences in skills, and I'm not sure if that's even like a good practice, you know? Like, yeah, I'm yeah, but a good rant. I appreciate it.
Always a good rant from Josh. You gotta love it. So this is funny. So I'm gonna have fun and just sort of push back on a couple things for fun, but also because it's a complicated issue. One is I was working on a construction job through a temp agency one summer, fresh out of college. And I don't think there's a lower level of construction work than working through a temp agency on a construction job. So, and I was working the way I had learned to work on this ranch in Montana, which was like the guy I worked with was wonderful, and I learned so much. And he was a super hard worker type, and I just picked up his whole ethic. And then so I'm bringing that to this job, and my coworkers, who were two people who did this kind of stuff pretty regularly. It's good, real solid, interesting, funny couple, working class, 100% like working class, itinerant kind of folks. And they were like, what are you doing? It's like, and they said, like, this doesn't have to win a beauty contest. And what I was doing was like digging out under where, what was going to be under the floor of a house that was being built. Like nobody would ever see it anyway, right? So it was all this kind of stuff. So what I found is that to me, the thing is, I mean, obviously, right, this is about exploitation and about what's considered valuable and what's considered important and what's valued, basically, right? So in that job, nothing was valued. These were cheap houses that were being built to be sold for millions because they were big and they were shiny and the construction was terrible. And so the whole idea of doing a really high quality job was not on the table. The whole point was do a crappy job as fast as you can. And that was the boss's attitude. But also my coworker's attitude was like, don't be an idiot. These people are just building crappy houses. Why are you going to dig in this? Why are you going to do this work in this super skilled way? Doesn't make any sense, right? So there was a way in which, yes, it was low skilled work. It was designed to be low skilled work. The employer wanted it to be low skilled work. Like that was the point of it, was to be low skilled work, because the goal was to exploit labor power efficiently and not waste time. So that was it. It's just cut corners, don't waste time. So in that way, I think it's not an illegitimate term, right? When they told me it doesn't have to win a beauty contest, they were saying, stop doing high skilled work. This is not what this is about.
Yeah, but just the fact that they were telling you, look, there are two different ways in which there's at least two different ways in which you can do this job. One, with a little bit more care and concern than what they were doing it with, right? It doesn't mean that labor itself, that particular job or doing, that work was unskilled. They were just saying you're putting more into it than we want you to. And it really, I mean, that's what I see happening in our economy. And having been a janitor lot of times, like cleaned a lot of public bathrooms. Like no one is encouraged to take these jobs seriously. You're not encouraged.
Right.
Like there's no reason for you to try to be good at your job because you're just a janitor, you know?
Right.
And despite the fact that I don't know about you, but I think public sanitation is kind of an important thing in our society. And so I personally like want the people who are doing that work to take it seriously and try to do a good job.
Yeah.
And it is, and that's just my thing. It's like philosophically and just like as a practical matter, there are levels of skill in any job, and that should be acknowledged, and that saying unskilled workers or low skilled workers, unskilled workers, that gets used a lot too. And it's kind of like I don't. It's like, okay, to me, it's not an unskilled worker. It's maybe somebody who hasn't been trained yet, right? I mean, I guess we can say that, but it's like, to me, that this language of unskilled and low skilled has a real kind of negative valence to it, more so than even just like a practical description of something. And I don't think it fits. But I mean, I appreciate that. And there are a lot of people who work these jobs who would disagree with me and be like, oh no, it's not.
Right.
So.
No, I mean, I think, that the point is, I think your point is basically, it's like, it's totally well taken. It's just that, and there are jobs like there's that book called Trampling Out the Vintage, I think, Frank Bardicky's book about farm labor organizing in California. And he talks about what the actual skills are that are involved in harvesting celery, maybe. And, exactly, type of work someone might consider unskilled. Just get a bunch of hands, migrant workers, and no problem. And it's, of course, not true at all. It's like crazy high-skilled, extremely difficult work to learn how to do. So there is a whole way in which work is just devalued and disregarded in a way that's not real. Like it's just not accurate. And I think the farm owners actually know it, right? Because they know that if they lose those workers, they're screwed. So there's some recognition. All right, here's another pushback, which is there is, I think, and this is in this Luis Rossetto book that I'm translating, he makes a big thing about his way of looking at it is, well, in co-ops, there's a question, do some people get paid more than others if they have higher skill? And that's always a debate, right? And so he says you could approach it a number of different ways. There's different principles, and you just have to decide what makes sense to you. It's a political choice, really. But he says, economically speaking, the so-called higher skilled labor, it's maybe better to think of it as people who are bringing additional factors. So the person is bringing labor, they're also bringing technology, and they're also bringing administrative skill, meaning administrative capacity. And so if you think of it as not a person with higher skills, but rather somebody bringing additional factors that they're contributing to the process, that shifts the discussion away from a skilled person and unskilled person to what factors do we have to account for? And how do we would have to pay for those on the market. If we didn't have a person who had those things, we'd have to hire somebody. And it would cost us a lot because all those factors combined are not so easy to find. So there's a logic to that I think is maybe. Mm-hmm. So like, whether the term is the issue or it's, or is this do you think that, how does that play for your rent?
Well, I mean, this came up. I mean, I was definitely thinking about this as I was proofreading chapter 5 of Rossetto's Cooperative Enterprise and Market Economy, which anybody watching should go read right now, or maybe after this is over. But the interesting thing, what I liked about his framing is that he came up with this concept of simple labor. That it's like you end up pricing all of the factor inputs that the members are bringing in terms of simple labor, and what simple labor means is, at least in my understanding, kind of it depends on the group of people. And as I was thinking about it, I think like, oh, it was interesting, like maybe in a co-op, like a worker co-op, simple labor would be like, I would think the labor that everybody who's a member can do, like the very baseline, everybody is trained at that same skill level, whatever it is. And then, people who have skills who can do additional tasks that others can't, that would be remunerated a little bit more because they have that additional skill. But I would also think then in a worker co-op, the goal would be to increase the level of what counts as simple labor over time, right, through cross training and everything. So if there are people who have particular skills that only they can do, ideally you want to expand that, spread that knowledge out. And so yeah, I did like that. I mean, and that's the thing, we do need to recognize skill, and I guess that's part of where my rant was going, is that like we stop ourselves from recognizing the presence or the possibility of skill in a particular type of labor when we just label it as, oh, this is unskilled. But it made a lot more sense in Rossetto's, formulation, where in the context of an enterprise, we need to do X, Y, and Z, and everybody can do X, but only, one person can do Z. So, and they, showed up with those skills. Yeah, so that they would, maybe get a little bit more. But yeah, as with everything in that, I think it's a really nice way to reconceptualize things in a way that, to me, feels more ethical.
Yeah, this is a debate that I've engaged in a bunch. Like when the market remunerates a certain job description at a level, and then this is my favorite example. So when I was a farmer, I was in this like startup course or something where like all of us new entrepreneurs were learning the basics of business development. And so I was in the course, and there was a graphic designer in the course. And we were like, oh my gosh, I need a logo. You need some work. Like, this will be fantastic. And so we looked at market value of our two different products. And so like a year of my CSA share was like half of what she would be charging on the market for her logo design. And so like, and then I was like, can we look at hours of work involved in both of these, but like at the end of the day, right, like this is what society is willing to pay for food, and this is what society is willing to pay for a logo. And I think like, so even within a co-op, you bring in somebody to be a marketing specialist and they're being compensated at a certain rate. And then you bring in somebody who's a janitor and they're being compensated at a different rate in like outside of the co-op. And it's really hard to come to agreement, I think, even though you want to do everything differently within your co-op. Like yeah, I think that's really hard.
Well, in that case, society sounds like an absurd fiction that we shouldn't be paying attention to. To quote Bakunin, when he was talking about the social contract. But it seems to me like at some points we might be talking about different ideas of skilled, so-called low skilled labor. But one thing I'm wary of is like how easy it is to stray away from needs-based economics and go straight back into the scarcity economics, which is very designed to get us to not be thinking about the people and how easy it is to separate the person from the labor. Like, are we compensating, this like absurd fiction of someone who's of act of labor, or are we dealing with other human beings? And I think that's kind of like what started this at the beginning when Josh started talking about this, is like we need to respect people. And yeah, I think that's something that we should always be pushing back against, like that scarcity mentality and that scarcity culture that's been that a lot of times, like, we're structured into it, but we have power to deviate from it as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, and there are definitely a lot of different issues that kind of are all wrapped up in this, and I think they're all, certainly related. And what Emmy brought up about what this type of labor gets on the market, in the non-co-op world, is a real issue. But and it came up in Rossetto's manual as well, and in his book. And of course, the problem is, but we all know, like, the reason we're doing the worker co-op thing is because we all know that the market undervalues particular types of labor and overvalues different things. Like the price structure of the market is messed up, big time. Trying to keep it family friendly here, so excuse me if I pause. It's because I'm trying to look for a word that's not considered profane. Having a hard time. It's so, we don't, because it's a problem. And I've written about this before, and talked about it. It's definitely something. We can really easily end up just recreating the exact same dynamics from the system that we're trying to escape through this kind of stuff. Like, well, I am a graphic designer, or I am a, whatever, I have a degree, or I'm an administrator, and I would be getting paid $80,000 if I just went and worked over here, and you're a janitor, or you're a home healthcare worker, and you would be getting paid $15,000 a year. And so maybe you should be happy getting 20,000 a year. And maybe I'll get up on my cross and only take 70,000 a year, right? And and we can end up having the same kind of dynamics. And so we need to really be aware of that. It's hard to get out of, though, because I think the fundamental way that our economy is structured, in which we all have individual bank accounts, like, I think that's the big issue. Like, we haven't wrapped our head around yet how to extract ourselves from this economy, when it's like, okay, we want everybody's needs to be taken care of. That's our fundamental goal. That's the essential goal. But then we have this instrumental goal, which is have money in your bank account. Like, that's how, right, everybody gets their needs taken care of, is you have enough financial resources to purchase them on the market to get those needs filled. And so we still are kind of stuck in this mindset of trying to get more money into people's individual bank accounts in order to get their needs filled, right? And so we end up, like, going after that instrumental goal, and it's hard. I don't have any solutions for it or anything. It's just this kind of, like, I see we get stuck in this framework. It's hard to get out of. Part of me is like, look, we need to just make a commitment to, we're trying to do things differently. And it doesn't matter if, in the rest of the economy, you could make, more money, if that's your goal, if that's the thing that's important to you, I guess go do that. It's like, at some point, it's like, well, we can't compete on that level. So I don't know, rambling.
That's
we
like
can change the topic. If that is, like, everybody's like, okay, well,
money. That's good.
We can-
Kills it. That's a buzzkill right there.
oh,
I don't know. One thing that surprised me when I first was reading Arizmendi Arrieta's ideas, right, the founder of Mondragon, one of the things that really struck me, kind of surprised me, was his pretty ardent defense of individual private property. In other words, workers should have bank accounts, and workers should have money in their bank accounts, and workers should own their houses, and he was like against the idea that everything becomes collectivized. And he had and it was from sort of a political economic thing. It was also from some kind of theological standpoint. There was a sense of, comes from Maritain and these writers who write about the person and personhood and the importance of the individual, and if the person is not being subsumed into the collectivity. So it was a complicated and deep argument, but so I still kind of find it, like, interesting and contradictory sometimes. I feel like, and that Rossetto very much is in the same tradition in that way. Like, he's his whole thing in that chapter 5 is about how members of a co-op should have labor shares that represent how much of the equity they contributed. And that's like I don't know any co-ops that do that in that form. So it's kind of, but I guess really, to me, the interesting question is the transitional idea that you raised, Josh. Like, I do think that simple labor idea, like if you measure at the beginning when you start the co-op, you're measuring by external standards because you had to buy stuff or you need a starting point. But as you go on, his argument is you start just measuring internally by the labor it takes you to do things. And then you start to really be able to free yourself from what's going on in the market and become just more reasonable about how long does it take us to do stuff, right? So then like the designing a logo is going to start to become that, that discrepancy is going to shrink because it doesn't make sense, right? It's not adding up in terms of the logic of what you're trying to do in the enterprise. So I don't know. There's something.
Yeah. I mean, there's also the issue with like the design thing, and sorry, I mean, I'll let you talk. It's like, well, yeah, it maybe only took me 2 hours to design this logo or 5 hours or whatever, but I spent the last 10 years, honing my craft. It's like I've got friends who are musicians who will like, complain about the same thing. Like nobody wants to pay. It's like, oh yeah, well, you just up there for an hour. I gave you $50. Like I've been working on this for 25 years, like, so, yeah, there's that as well, that comes into it. So, no easy answers here, I don't think. Yeah.
I think what I was going to put in was, so recently, I think when I'm engaging in conversations about co-op, like people who are interested in the co-op movement, I think everyone is attracted to, or when they first hear of co-ops, if they've never heard of co-ops, they're attracted to this idea of like, oh wait, there's a different way to do things because things aren't working. Like right now, how society is structured, it's not working. And then they start getting into co-ops, and then it gets too big too fast, It's like, oh, and then we have to collectivize this, and we have to do that, and then that only works if like we have a co-op daycare, and then we have co-op retirement home, and then we have a co-op healthcare system, and then it's like, and then it gets so overwhelming, and then they revert back. Well, that's why capitalism exists, because like obviously we can't build all these things, and so like. I think recently when I'm talking to people who are curious about it, I'm trying to bring it right back down to like what that group of people is trying to accomplish together. And there can be all sorts of other like connections and ways that they're going to be collectively organizing outside of the co-op. And yeah, you're going to start a movement, and you're going to be, just you being like happy and thriving in your co-op is going to like be wonderful for spreading co-ops like spirit to other spheres. But like actually like let's narrow our conversation right now as we start to develop our own co-op. And yeah, like sometimes that means breaking it down to very like boring silos and of tasks and roles, and having uncomfortable conversations about compensation. I think like I was really thrilled when I joined SSG about how they managed the compensation question. They basically said, you list all of your work experience, and it could be from when you were like, if you started working at 12, then you put that down and say like what your full-time equivalent hour was and how related, like on a scale to from 0 to 100%, how related is it to the work that you're going to be doing at SSG? And then add all that up, and that becomes a factor by which we multiply this base salary. And it's transparent. Everybody can look at your list, and it felt really fair. And it felt like it also recognized the fact that, if you have more years of experience, even if they're not related, it probably means that you've been around for a little bit longer and have accumulated all sorts of life experience, and also probably have a lot more responsibilities and like financial, responsibilities in the world, like a mortgage or a family. And so that necessarily compensates in that way, which I don't know, like all of that made a lot of sense to me. It was a really easy way to break it down, not overly complicated. It's not separated by what jobs we do, but essentially in what we're bringing to the table. Yeah. So anyway, I don't know if that's helpful or.
Yeah, well, that's it's definitely the first time I've heard of that type of way of setting a, looking at compensation coming in. So
They did something similar at Open Collective Foundation recently, right? And it's online. You can see the formula that they use, and you can see their salaries, which I think is great. Like, talk about transparency. Like, you can find out what folks are making. And they also had, I think, I think they did something similar to what you just described. And then they also had a kind of needs thing, some way to indicate, simple stuff. How many dependents do you have? Like, how many people are relying on this money? Just framing it in that respect too. But I think something you said earlier that I think really like totally struck a chord with me, which is this totally interesting problem. It's really a big frustrating thing for organizing, which is you start to have a discussion about what it is that we care about, what we're dissatisfied with, what we want to change, right? And if it's a good discussion, people are going to want to change a lot. And yet what'll happen is that you get into a discussion that has no relationship to your capacity to have any impact on anything. And in a minute, you've set yourself up with like you're responsible. Like I did it with folks here. Suddenly people were talking as if they could change the entire food system by changing the government policy and changing, a million things at once. And it was so funny. I was like, we are nobody. We're like six people sitting around a table. Nobody gives a damn what we think. And that's really a good thing. Because if we start there, it means it's starting cleaner. It's like starting with what do we actually really care about and what can we start to build together, instead of kind of what resources can we leverage based on our clout and our connections and that way of thinking, which is pretty kind of like what Chris said earlier. There's a sort of fantasy element to people's idea that's of their ability to influence the state and change this thing around them just by wishing it were better, so I don't know. I found it, I was like, oh yeah, it's not about solving all the problems we can think of. It's about, can we solve a couple right here? And wouldn't that be fabulous? So I'm down with that. I didn't feel like that's convincing to me.
yeah, that's something. At some point, as I was maturing, I realized that this kind of latent desire I felt, and it seemed like a lot of people like had to like quote unquote save the world, was just incredibly egotistical and really like ridiculous, and like like maybe you should just focus on go take care of your garden and that kind of stuff, focus on your own neighborhood. And yeah, I think that and we've actually, this is something that's come up in GEO. It's one of the first issues that I ever remember us talking about, like almost 10 years ago now. My first GEO retreat was something called the hype cycle, the co-op hype cycle. And he'd seen it a couple of times, and we've definitely seen it multiple times since then, where some new co-op thing comes on the scene. At the time, it was the evergreen cooperatives. And the anchor institution model was the new hotness. And we had the hype cycle, and the beginning of the hype cycle is, oh my God, this is, the next big thing. It's going to change everything. And you generally have lots of nonprofit people talking it up like all over the place. And the numbers are really big. We're going to have 50 co-ops in the next 10 years, and we're going to be employing 5,000 people and all this stuff. And then, if it's successful, if the hype is successful enough, they get the money and stuff to actually start doing something, then the reality sets in, and it's like, okay, actually running businesses is really hard, and maybe we're a bunch of nonprofit people and don't understand how to do this very well. and it's just, and things are hard and shit happens. So the reality sets in, and then like 5 years down the road, instead of 10 co-ops that had been talking about, you've got two or one, or and you're only employing 30 people instead of 500, and you know and people just kind of, the hype just kind of dies away, but nobody ever like stops and reflects on that whole thing. And then we do and then it happens again. Then there's the next big thing that's, oh, I feel like the drivers co-op has gone through this, and a lot of co-ops that the platform co-op thing, just in general, there's a whole lot of hype, and then the messy reality happens, and then most people look away to the next thing that's on the that's being hyped up. And I think it's damaging, just because we get people's expectations out of line, like, oh wow, we're gonna like save our city or whatever with worker co-ops, and then reality is like, well, you got 4 or 5 cool businesses and a few better jobs, and that's not nothing. But and people can then just like, oh yeah, feel like they got let down. Sound familiar to anybody else? Chris, you were smiling during some of that.
No, I just wondering who's gonna write the book on the hype cycle. Right, that's what's gonna happen. Right? Who's gonna be that historian?
It's the new relationship energy as applied to co-op development. But it also reminds me of that famous Amilcar Cabral quote, right? Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. It's like, I think it's a lot of it is the responsibility of all of us who hype things up because we're excited, and like because of what Emmy said, because we want to solve every problem in the world. So here comes this thing that we could hype up into the solution for every problem, and the poor people doing it that's not helping them. It's like doing them no favors by hyping them up. Although, I don't know, I think maybe people do co-ops for lots of different reasons, and some of the projects, I feel like some projects that have more of an overt sort of political goal, the spreading the message and promoting the ideology may actually be as important a goal to them as getting institutions up and running. It depends on your theory of change, right? And so there may be situations where people are like, where the hype cycle is just a different politics. It's just kind of, I mean, that's definitely not the case with Evergreen, right? That sounds like more standard kind of like hyping a business and with the new innovative solution.
Yeah.
But
and while we're on Evergreen, I have to mention this because I want to get it on record as many places as possible. The greenhouse demutualized like a year ago. One of the big Evergreen co-ops, their first one that they hyped up, and I heard somebody from Democracy Collaborative giving an interview not too long ago, and they still were claiming the greenhouse co-op as part of the Evergreen co-ops. It's on their website. I should pull it up so I can prove it to people. But yes, they demutualized. They sold to an Illinois company. So they sold to an out-of-state capitalist corporation, maintaining the jobs, but it's not a co-op anymore. So, it's like there's the end of the hype cycle. And it's like, think about how much we heard about Evergreen at the beginning, like back in, when they were, starting out 15 years ago or something. And then we heard a whole lot when that greenhouse was getting set up. We heard nothing about it when it got demutualized. So, yeah, anyway, and this is, I feel a little bit bad because I feel like I end up being the naysayer so often, but it's like, but if there's so much of the hype cycle, or the hype stuff, or the, wanting to, oh, we're going to save everything, that, I often feel like, okay, I'm trying to push back on a little bit, but then I feel like I'm just always doing that. It's like, man, what a bummer.
I would love more co-ops to maybe of a certain size to talk more openly, kind of like the fuck up nights of like the entrepreneur world. Like, what was it that like didn't work? And I think a lot of things end up being around having a challenging time balancing doing the work and managing the work or something along those lines. But I think it'd be really great to hear.
Yeah. So, okay. Indiana, I was wrong. I said Illinois. The Evergreen Cooperative Corporation here, just so I'm backing myself up, and Green City Growers Boards recently sold GCG, Green City Growers, to Local Roots Cleveland, a company headquartered in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So anyway, that happened on May 19th, 2022. So just about a year ago. So at any rate, if you hear somebody talking, or you read, as I did recently, in an article, I think in Politico, about this, and they're still referring to Green City Growers as a co-op, it ain't true. So, and yeah, it's something we should talk about. Let's have the fuck up nights. Let's talk about what doesn't work. That's how you learn from your mistakes and grow. But if you're a nonprofit and you're trying to get money for your next project, the thing you don't do, it seems like, is talk about how your last one didn't go all that great and there were a bunch of problems. Like, that doesn't seem like, nobody seems to do that. So you just talk about the good stuff. And once again, I'll mention this, I've mentioned it before on live stream, but I have literally been told by people in the co-op movement who are not just like nobodies, that we should not talk at all anything negative, anything critical, in public. All criticism should be kept in private, and only positive stuff should be made public, which to me is a recipe for, lots of shenanigans going on when you're not allowed to talk about, we like censor ourselves about talking about criticism in public. So part of the reason for this live stream. Yes.
Well, it'll be easier when you meet the co-ops that want to openly, who want to make agreements to go totally against that. But yeah, and I know what you're talking about having to be like the only person who like disagrees with stuff. It's a special burden that I don't like to have. A lot of times I'm like, I can't be the only person who feels this way. Like, why do I gotta be the first person that says it? And then it turns out that, I don't like it either.
Yeah.
On behalf of a yes person, I thank you for your contrarian attitudes, because I definitely am somebody who doesn't say the thing. I struggle with it. So
I usually say, like, all right, let's crash and burn. Who cares? I'm gonna say it. Yeah, it's kind of like the attitude that I usually have.
Yeah.
there's an entrepreneurial, like one of these like startup hokey dokey things that you do a post-mortem, like you as a group brains like go to the like, okay, everything has failed. Why? Even before it's failed, to get people to actually talk about what their real fears are. Because like if you're talking about implementing something to work towards a project, nobody actually wants to offer that, like, but what about this thing? Yeah, I've tried doing that to get me to start owning my fears. And yeah, it just feels so precarious when you're building something to then throw in a fear in there, or a doubt, or lose that momentum.
Right.
I think
And
it's
yet,
also because, like, well, in co-ops, right? It's like I was just thinking about that. Like, what was that? Impact Hub Tokyo, I think, had that. I mean, everybody does it, I'm sure, but they had their fuck up Friday or whatever it was. And it was a totally cool idea. On the other hand, it's like, if you're one person and or two or three people, and you take a shot at something and it blows up and you go on to the next thing, it's easier to process. It's easier to have that conversation than if you're a group of like 20 people who invested the only money that you got in the world and just killed yourselves with sweat equity and worked for years, and then the thing dies miserably and you hate each other. like there's postmortems and there's postmortems, right? So I think there's like it's because I was just thinking to myself, yeah, this is so right, but why in the co-op? I never hear co-op postmortems of that type. Occasionally there are articles here and there, but not very frequent. I think it's just because there's a whole lot more. In part, it's because there's so much invested in it. I mean, yeah, and that's hard. But I don't know. I think it's a good point. We totally should do that. I had a good talk with Jim Johnson the other day about this co-op here, Organic Gardens, which was a landscaping co-op that had a brilliant business model, no problem. And yet, because of it was a conversion and how they got started, etc., they weren't able to gel the solidarity group at the core of it that would sustain them. And so personal conflicts killed them. But luckily, they were able to close out the co-op in a pretty comradely and sort of organized way. So it was that transition actually was kind of a good story. It was, it's a bummer it doesn't exist, but
yeah,
it didn't fail because it was a bad idea or because it's not possible or anything like that. Just sometimes it just doesn't stick together, and theirs didn't. So I don't know. I do feel like that probably is a good story to tell and get out there, right? Because
yeah, you should, because you wrote the story about them starting and getting converted to a worker co-op or starting that in the first place. So yeah, it'd be good to get that whole thing, because we do like to talk a lot about how worker co-ops have a better success rate than traditional businesses, and it's definitely true. But it doesn't mean that they all work out, and it doesn't mean that that there aren't problems. And I think about, like, if you want to take since at least three of us are Americans here, we must use military metaphors. It's like they have something called the after action report, right? I mean, you just went out on your patrol or whatever, and a bunch of guys come back shot up. You do an after action report. You gotta do your debrief and figure out what the heck went wrong. And if we never do that, you're just asking for problems. And it's kind of the same thing with when Nimi was saying, when you're starting a project, you don't want to be like kind of bringing the energy down by bringing in the fears and the what ifs. But on the other hand, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, well, if you fail to think about that, it's like buying a house and like, oh well, what if there's a fire? Should we get fire insurance? Oh, I don't want to think about that. It's a bummer. It's like we need to do that, kind of stuff, and we need to, when we fail or things don't go right, I think it's so important to do that. And you're right, not many people do. Some people who did, who I'd like to just point out, is the Renaissance Food Co-op. They put a lot of effort into that. It was kind of ran for a couple of years, I think, and then kind of petered out. And Ed Whitfield and can't remember the other, a woman who was involved in that, did a really good kind of post-mortem on a podcast about that and talked a lot about it. But yeah, I think we need a lot more of that, right? The sharing stories. So, Chris?
So how much of this problem is the nonprofit influence? Because I just feel like in the co-op, when I think of co-ops developing, there isn't such a strong hype logic to them. Like it's just you need to promote yourself to the people who could be customers and other people in your ecosystem, but you don't have to hype yourself up, because that's not really very helpful. But I think any of the projects I think of that are super hypey are the ones that are going after grant funding or outside investors, right? They're looking for money. So they have to be the coolest, sexiest thing in the world, right? Is that just my bias, or is that
does anybody else want to answer? I certainly have a response.
I was just feeding the lion right there. You want a big piece of steak, Josh?
Okay. Yeah, I think you put your finger right on it, Matt. Just grab that third rail there. Yeah, because this is, I don't think anybody wants to talk about. I will say this. I will not mention any names, but I once saw a planning document for a nonprofit that's involved in a lot of worker co-op development from when they were starting their nonprofit. And I was not supposed to see this, but I did. It was leaked, and as it were. And the plan for this nonprofit was to set up some worker co-ops, get some worker co-ops set up, and then use those worker co-ops as PR to pitch their services to other places who wanted to build worker co-ops. But from the planning document, it was clear that the purpose of starting the worker co-ops was to serve the nonprofits revenue, funding, to serve their funding needs. Not like it wasn't for the benefit of the workers, right? And another thing that's just like worker co-ops are for, right, for workers, should be, you would think, set up by workers. It seems weird to have an outside group coming in and, setting up something for your benefit. But in this case, it was very clear from their documents that the thought process, and I don't think there was necessarily anything nefarious going on here. It's just nonprofit people thinking like nonprofit people. This is how this is how they were thinking. So yeah, they have that, that the necessity to pitch themselves as being successful, or pitch themselves as being able to do, impressive things in order to get the impressive amounts of money from the funders. And we've seen it in New York City, where, there's been some pretty fast and loose kind of, talk about, the numbers and how many worker co-ops were actually formed with the money that the city devoted to worker co-op development. And again, it's this touchy issue where, on the one hand, we want there to still be money for worker co-op development. So we don't want to be messing up that money flow. But on the other hand, we don't want to just be kind of looking the other way with a lot of, development efforts that aren't working well, or co-ops that are being claimed as co-ops, but they're not actually co-ops. They are more kind of aspirational. They thought about it, but there are these incentives for nonprofits specifically to be misleading about the success of their efforts and things like that. And for me, a big red flag is when there's a lack of transparency. And we definitely have seen that with a lot of the bigger co-op projects. Like when co-op researchers, not like people like me or GEO who might publish this, publicly, but like people who are going to maintain your confidentiality, go and has to just take a look at the numbers, and they no. To me, that's a big red flag. And that's certainly heard those kind of stories from some places. So
I wouldn't say that co-ops don't need hype, though. I mean, yeah, you want people to support your business over another business if you're relying on customers. You want your services to be seen as reliable, and you want to be known. We're trying to hype ourselves up. We would love more support getting our name out there, as more municipalities need environmental consultants. I think there is, and we really value the role that these co-op associations have played in hyping us up, in letting other organizations know about our existence when they need our services. So I don't know. And I agree. I think any grant that is dependent on number of co-ops developed, I think is a wrong metric to gauge whether or not you're being effective by, because sometimes a co-op model isn't the right model for what a group is trying to do. And you, as somebody who is trying to organize, should not be shoehorned into creating co-ops and forcing people to down this legally incorporate path. And at the same time, there is a lot of organizing that needs to be done, and it's really great if that work can be supported financially by people who have, or like, you know, organizations that are trying to achieve the same like social outcomes as what we're trying to organize for. You know, like I had a I had an interesting conversation with a union organizer who was like, the co-op movement's really annoying because they're expecting workers to like, you know, find the time to make a business when they're already strapped and they're like having to manage all of these different priorities, and it's really hard to organize a business. So like we need to go in there and help them freaking organize. Like he's like, I hate it. Like co-op people want too much from us, kind of thing. It's really interesting. So yeah, I don't know. There's obviously like so many different sides to everything, but
Yeah. On that, this is like a little tangential, but just that last little anecdote, Emmy, got me thinking. Another one of the, I don't know, things that's been running through my head a lot the last couple of, I don't know, months or year or so, is that, yeah, it's really, it's hard and it's risky. And specifically, it's real risky to start a worker co-op, a new one. And I know lots of people, myself included, who would love to work at a worker co-op, but do not want to try to start a business on our own. Like that, like those are two completely separate things, right? Like, yes, I want to work in a business and be, you know, where I have, you know, some say in the management, and it's a democratic workplace. But I want to like get a job at Arizmendi, right, when they've been around, and you don't have to worry about, is this thing going to work out, you know? And you're not having to just volunteer your labor and not get paid for the first couple of years while you're getting things situated. And I think that as the co-op movement, like those of us who, you know, just are trying to work for the larger movement, that I think it's incumbent upon us to try to figure this out, because when you look at like just from the point of view of a worker, somebody looking for a job, and you like, okay, here's all the, you know, places that are hiring. I just go, I do what they tell me to do, and they give me a paycheck. Or I can go over here to the worker co-op people, and I go to a bunch of classes and I invest a bunch of money, and then maybe hopefully something works out. It's just like, of course they're going to go, you know, even if you don't like the job, it's still like a much easier offer to accept. And that we in the co-op movement should be really thinking about how we can make it more like that, but in a way that's not damaging the democratic character of it, right? There definitely does need to be help for organizing. There needs to be financial support so that you're not having to put your life savings on the line to hope that your co-op business works out. Like that, people, especially people without much to begin with, should not be, you know, we shouldn't be encouraged. I don't want to be encouraging somebody to do that, and we shouldn't be asking folks to do that. So, you know, that's, you know, I've had, you know, thoughts like, you know, I've talked with some GEO people about the, you know, like, oh, you know, if we could have a fund of some of the larger, more successful co-ops, you know, kind of like how they do in Italy or Puerto Rico, you know, kind of pay into a fund that's specifically for development. And then maybe like as a co-op movement, you know, people from Arizmendi, from Isthmus Engineering, or, you know, from Cooperative Home Care, and like some of the, you know, the bigger co-ops getting together and being like, okay, we put together this fund of money. Let's set up a co-op. Do we want to do another, you know, bakery co-op somewhere? Do we want to, you know, set up a home care co-op somewhere? We have a bunch of money that, you know, we can fund it. Just like Arizmendi, when they are expanding their bakeries, the new worker co-op, the people starting that aren't expected to fund it, that Arizmendi funds it out of the Arizmendi Association, you know, fund. So anyway, I think it is a big issue, and it's something that we should, deserve some thought on the co-op side. So I take those critiques real seriously.
I think it's about being, just thinking in practical experience here, it's just about being organized enough, which means not just how you are logistically organized, but also kind of politically or, you know, intellectually organized enough so that you don't get thrown off track by what money does when money comes into the equation. Because the money fits really well and serves very well in the standard system. And So it's very easy for it to disorganize you and reorient you towards all those priorities and all those values and all those kind of dynamics. And the only way not to do that is to have an extremely strong group that can maintain labor sovereignty, right? Can maintain power over capital. So that capital doesn't screw you up, but you're screwing capital up in a sense by using those resources to these other ends, right? I feel like and that's like that's a conversation that I just feel like nobody's ever, in terms of people I've been talking with, we've never had that conversation. So we don't know how to have it. So we immediately, when money comes in, when we got a grant for one project, and just it immediately started to screw up the relationships. And we had to really quickly jump on it and say, okay, wait a minute. We don't want this to happen. We kept, yes, we'll get the grant, cool, but we have to do a lot of work to build the relationships, reinforce them so that we're not going to get disoriented and redirected basically towards the needs of capital, because the money knows how to do its work, but we have to use money is it's not simple. It's not like obvious what you have to do. You have to really be organized and thoughtful, I think, and especially keep that focus on the relationships with people. That's my sermon.
Well,
we need a new topic.
Well, we have another topic. I don't know if we can how to segue into this, but we did talk at our last live stream, or the one before that maybe, about this law. I guess it's a statute in Illinois, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, that the Limited Worker Cooperative Association statute that allows for a business to call itself a worker co-op as long as it has at least 51% ownership by worker members. Is that correct, Chris? Am I?
No. That's a different topic. We were just.
My bad.
Oh, okay. I think I know what you're talking about. So we were talking about this one worker co-op worker co-op. I'm doing the quotes. In Illinois, we don't know if it's a worker. I don't know if it's a worker co-op or not. And we're looking at, well, what is the law saying in Illinois for who can call itself a worker co-op? Because it looked like it's just one person. So we're looking into the statute. I'm sorry, the law. I think that's what you're referring to.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we looked at.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So that is the statute. So it did allow for a co-op that only has one member, but that one member has to itself be a co-op. So that kind of made sense. Like it wasn't, just an individual person couldn't call themselves a co-op, but it did also include this, like, the co-op may have up to 49% of the voting shares can be owned by outside investors. It's at the worker's discretion whether those investor shares are given any voting power or not. So you could have like outside ownership with no voting power, which would be more similar to what we're used to with preferred shares. But it leaves it up for to the members, the worker members of the worker co-op, or to the co-op to decide whether or not investors get voting rights, and they could get up to 49%.
Wait, are we still talking about the Illinois law?
It's the same law.
Did you see that in the law?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm recalling that correctly, and that was the same one with like that can have one owner as well.
Oh, okay.
But only if the owner is a co-op. But so I don't know, on that anyway, I thought we'd talk a little bit about just in general worker cooperative statutes, because it is something that's coming up more. People trying to get creative with some of these statutes, and I don't know what you all think is acceptable innovation and what we should maybe be steering away from.
Yeah, one reason why I brought it up is because I'm trying to get educated about how some people are doing things in Texas, because I'm spending more time here again. And I sent an email recently. To it was like the Austin. I forgot the organization. I'm sorry. But it looks like it connects a bunch of the co-ops. And so I emailed them and a bunch of the worker co-ops, and I just asked for if they could what some of the Texas laws are, if there's something else aside from one law that I had come across. I should have been better prepared. I was looking for my emails. I was looking at my emails and I can't find the email that I sent, which makes me wonder if it even went out. Yeah, and so I asked a bunch of the worker co-ops to, like, hey, if there aren't any laws, can you share your bylaws to see kind of how you're navigating this? Which I've never thought about it. Is that kind of a taboo thing to ask? But I just went ahead and asked it. But yeah, I'm just kind of curious, like, what are because as soon as I started getting more involved in worker cooperativism, like, I found people to talk about it. There was already, like, in Illinois, the worker cooperative, limited worker cooperative act, that was already being drummed up as something that was going to be coming out, and I think some people already had access to, like, the drafts of the language. And so I never had to really think about situations where there isn't a law already in a state that recognizes some type of worker co-op. And so I just wanted to get more educated about, well, what about, how do these look in other states, or how do people navigate things when there isn't such a thing in their state, and whatever else anybody wants to talk about.
We have to talk about mountain munchies. We're going to talk about this question, because this was a debate. We talked about this at some length in mountain munchies. I know, because I was fixated on the topic at the time. So
Are you going to explain to anyone what mountain munchies is, Matt?
I think that's Emmy's job.
No.
All right, look, I'll do it. Emmy, Matt, and I were part of a collective fiction writing group. We wrote a story together about a co-op in the near future in Missoula, Montana, called Mountain Munchies. And it's a multi-stakeholder co-op, consumers, producers, and workers. So, Matt, what was this big conversation that Mountain Munchies had, our fictional co-op?
Oh, honestly, I'm trying to remember how it came into the plot, but basically there was this pseudo co-op organization that they were collaborating, that the established co-op, that Mountain Munchies was collaborating with this other group, which was put itself forward as a co-op. And in our discussions about the plot and trying to sort out how this worked and what type of organization it was, etc., we did talk about these laws, which started in Wyoming, I think, was the first state that adopted this kind of loosening the strictures about co-ops, so that allowing for that 49% of ownership by outside investors, making possible this kind of voting share scenarios. It went from there to Minnesota, I think, and then it's spreading. Other states have adopted it. But one thing that I remember from trying to figure it out and looking it up was that when the Wyoming one was, before it was passed, there was somebody from the Department of Agriculture, from the USDA co-op division for ag co-ops, who wrote a really great opinion piece about it, and basically was just fierce. And he was like, why do we even call these things co-ops? Like, what is the point? If we're going to go this direction, why are we even bothering? And because I feel like, from my experience in terms of how organizations are run in the labor movement, I feel like if you give 40%, 49% ownership to people who are investing money, and want to return, they're going to be super organized people with a lot of capacity for getting their needs met, because that's what they do. And they're going to be up against a membership that's highly unlikely to be as organized and focused and good at getting its needs met on this issue. And all they have to do is buy off a few members, and they've got their magical majority vote in a heartbeat. I just think it's like it's a disastrous scenario, and that whole 49% thing I think is meaningless in practice. So
Yeah.
anyway,
I want to make a clarification here, and Chris, just so you don't think I'm a complete idiot. And this was from conversations we were having over email a couple of months ago. So trying to jog my memory here. So looking at the Illinois statute, they don't actually specify percentages. They do say that any member shares, you can allocate voting rights however you want. But where I got the 49-51% and that it was up to the workers to decide, that was actually from an email conversation with somebody who interviewed a Chicago co-op and asked them about it, and that was what they said. So but actually I'm looking at the act now, and what it says for voting, I just lost it here, but yeah, basically says that voting rights can be allocated among any members, and doesn't really put any limitations on what the relationship of those members necessarily has to be, it looks like, so, to the co-op. Yeah. There was another co-op legislation thing that came up probably over a year ago at this point in California. I wrote a little about on GEO, but it's kind of brought up another, problematic or, aspect of worker cooperative statutes. And this is a California law that was being considered that would create a worker cooperative federation in California, and the member co-ops of said federation would give all of their control over wage rates and hiring and firing decisions and who's managing their co-op to the federation. So the worker co-op federation would be setting wage rates and making the day-to-day business decisions, is how they had it set up. This is Assembly Bill 1319. I don't think it passed, or I'm sure it did not pass, but it might be coming back. So there was an interesting thing about this. One, I didn't really hear much of any talk about it. I kind of randomly found it on actually just a conservative California news site. I'm just doing Google searches, and it popped up, and I read the act and thought, well, this sounds really odd. This is not worker co-ops that as we know them. And it turned out it was the SEIU, it was the group really pushing it. And I talked to some folks with that organization who were involved with this, and they actually said yeah, we ran it by co-op people and nobody liked it. We didn't get any good feedback on it, but they went through with it anyway. But also none of the worker co-op people were really raising a stink about it. So except for me, I thought it was messed up. So, and I will actually, because I keep talking about law stuff, I just want to make sure here. Okay, let's get this on the record. So here we have, let's see, there's a Cooperative Economy Act is what it's called. So it sets up a federation, declares the formation of a Federation of California Worker Co-ops. And then down here it talks about the here we go. At least 51% of the workers are worker owners. Okay. There's a 51% in there. I should have maybe looked at this beforehand. I don't know where the on any. So anyway, this the way it was structured was very odd. When I talked to co-op people, some people in California said, yeah, we looked at it and it needed some work, and the issue for me, having had some involvement with legislative issues in the past, when I was in college and stuff, learning a little bit about how the actual legislature works. The problem when you submit a bill is you don't have any control over it once it's submitted, right? I mean, once it can get amended, it can get completely changed, it can have everything stripped out of it and completely adjusted. And so like a bill like this to me is just really kind of scary because you don't know what's going to end up in it. And yeah, and also it was being pushed not by worker co-op people. And it was being pushed by, a large union, and it kind of is, and it's very in a union vein, right? It's not surprising at all that that's who came up with this. Yes, the initial board would be appointed by the governor. That was another thing I found a little bit odd, but anyway, there were problems.
The labor background on this, which is, I think SEIU is sort of taking advantage of people's lack of familiarity with what they've been up to in the labor movement, and so because it can all sound very good, but there's two things in the background. One of them is a campaign, 20 years or more of consolidation by SEIU and a number of other unions. So like right now, if you look at many SEIU locals, their numbers are things like 521, 721, 321. It means 3 locals were combined into one local, or 5 locals were combined into one local. So, and some of these so-called locals are statewide in California. So a statewide local is bigger than just many unions around the world. It's just a huge organization. And it's not local in any meaningful sense. So it's really hard for members to have any effective democratic control, because the law requires them to have certain procedures for a local. It has to have elections and other things. But if you make it big enough, it's really hard to run as a candidate in your union local if it's statewide. How are you going to campaign, right? So it's a very intentional sort of centralization strategy that SEIU had. And the other piece of it is their leadership has talked about this a lot over the years, is to become partners with the big corporate employers or with state governments, because they represent a lot of public sector workers. And basically to become, a little bit like what some of the unions in Japan are, which is basically the HR and personnel department of the company. It's like it's very integrated into the corporation. In this case, SEIU is they look at the co-op thing as a way to have a kind of business that would then be run by the union and have a contract with the government or with the big providers. So they see co-op as a possible business format for a union nonprofit type of scenario where you could run these things. So that, I think all that kind of thinking is what's going on behind this. And it's totally anti-democratic. I mean, it's amazingly explicitly anti-democratic.
Yeah.
It's not about member control.
And I found the section in here and I wanted to read it just so people know here. It says, powers and duties of the Federation. Subject to the provisions of this chapter, the Federation shall set the labor policy of the members, including but not limited to policies for hiring, firing, promotion, discipline, compensation, and assignment of work. The Federation shall provide all management to the members. A member shall not directly employ its own management professionals. Any management professional shall be an employee of the Federation, provided to the member via a management contract between the member and the Federation. So this is like if the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops were in charge of setting wage policies and hiring and firing policies for all the members of the Federation and hiring their management. And so when I asked the SEIU people, like, okay, you talked to worker co-op people in California, and they all said, of course, we would not join this federation. This is not, what are you like? And their plan is that they're going to set up these co-ops specifically to fill out this federation. These co-ops that are not really co-ops because the members of the actual human members of the co-ops will not have an actual say on their anything to do with their business. So this is what the SEIU is trying to do. And yes, it's not real kosher. Thank you, Matt, for being critical, because it's not real kosher in the co-op world right now to be critical of this kind of stuff. But
so then, do all the workers essentially become state employees? I mean, is that how like it might turn out? Or
no, they're not state employees. I mean, and that's the thing. This federation was being created by an act of state, right? By an act of the state government, but it's not. Apart from that, it doesn't have anything to do with the state. They're not working for the state. They were actually thinking with this, I think, that this would be a federation of like platform worker co-ops who would be doing like Uber drivers and DoorDash and stuff like that. Because if I recall correctly, this is part of the whole deal with their thing in California about whether or not gig workers, platform workers were going to be paid as employees or 1099 contract workers, and they lost that battle, and so they were trying to figure something else out. This is what they came up.
I'm not sure that this is related to that issue, because what I understood of when I looked into this a couple of years ago was that this was very much aimed at home care workers, other medical workers in particular, and that it was, and there is a tricky issue there always about are they employed by the state? Are they contractors? It's all like, it's sort of messy, and SEIU wants to shape that. I mean, you got to give them credit for ambition, right? They really want to determine how the industry is structured, and they've done that in other places where they've successfully made people into state employees who weren't considered state employees, and that was really good in terms of benefits and other conditions. So I think it's that issue. I don't think it's the platform issue that's driving this. I think it's more healthcare workers that they're.
I could be conflating it. I know that issue came up in our conversation, but it has been a while.
Oh, well, okay. Yeah, and I know it's come up in New York and all, right? Because SEIU and other unions have not played a particularly great role on the question of workers in gig type jobs.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. That's just bizarre, right?
Yeah. So I mean, again, this is a thing that I think some of us we kind of have a duty to pay attention to this, because people who are running their worker co-ops, are maybe not paying attention to this. I mean, it's hard to pay attention to it. There's all this stuff going on, and a lot of it can fly by under the radar. It doesn't get any commentary from anybody. And so like with this, when I brought it up, when I started bringing it up, when I found it, pretty much nobody had heard about it. Everybody's like, what are you talking about now? And I feel like even if our conversation about it might be a little bit uninformed or not as informed as it could be, at least somebody we need to be bringing these issues up and talking about it. So apologies if I haven't been 100% accurate on all of my takes here, but doing our best. Somebody's got to do it.
And it had that 51% too, right?
Well, yes. So it did have something about 51%. I believe that what it was saying was 51% of employees in the member co-ops need to be members.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting, and I think I told you like in 2017 or 2018 when the co-op sphere started being like a little more open, developed. Well, I didn't tell you this part, but there's like 8 numbers that I heard most often. One is like cooperative principles 1 through 7, right? And then the eighth number was 51%, and that was I heard it everywhere, and that's why I brought it up to. That's the reason why I mentioned it to Geo, like, hey, can
Uh-huh.
we talk about this? Because I heard people talk about it all the time, and then the pandemic happened, and there's like, I could never talk to anybody about that 51%, this idea of 51% worker ownership. But it's
Yeah.
traveling to get more popular. State, it got found its way to a
Yeah.
proposal.
Well, and this, and we know it, Matt, it's the Wyoming bill or something, right? That has an even more egregious
Well,
percentage, I think, than just 49% or,
there, I put in the chat an article from
oh,
some consulting law firm about the Minnesota bill, which was the one based on the came after Wyoming, but was based on it. I feel like maybe that one is even more broad than the Wyoming one, but yeah. But that's a different 51%. That's about ownership and voting. So anyway, we got to do. Yeah, we got to get Josh into like a. We don't have to hype, but we need to get. We need to also focus on some of the good work that's being done.
oh, yes. No,
I
we
know you
do
do
for
that.
sure. We do next time. Okay,
I
wait a
know.
minute. We'll pull something. We'll pull something off the site. Well, I mean, we can talk about. Um, well, look, I'll promote this here. We had a great submission from the Valley Alliance of Worker Cooperatives, and they wrote this nice story for us about how this newly created multi-stakeholder cooperative, the Flatiron Coffee House Co-op. They opened up in December, and then, or they opened up last year, and then on December 30th, their espresso machine's motor failed. Huge disaster for a coffee shop, obviously, and um, they immediately had their revenue was tanking, and this is a co-op with both consumer and worker members. Flatiron, they already had an existing loan with shared capital, which that's always an issue if you're trying to look for lending and you already have loans and liens on stuff. That can be an issue. And so they're also members of the Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops, and pretty quickly after this disaster happened, Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops and Shared Capital people got together and worked out a loan plan for them so that they could fund them get their espresso machine up and working. And the funding for it came out of Vox Intercooperative Loan Fund, which is a loan fund that is created through the Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops, member co-ops putting 5% of their net revenue or 5% of their surplus into the fund, and then it's available for doing things like this. So we have a success story here, Principle 6 in action. Definitely worth a read. And I also made a little audio version for people who want to listen instead. And that was Chris' suggestion on the audio. I'm going to try to start doing that more because more accessibility is always better. So anyway, there's our positive end on an upbeat. Co-ops are awesome. Going to save the world. Solve all the problems.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Josh.
Solve all the problems. We're gonna do it.
Okay. Well, all right. I think we're good for tonight. Thanks for coming on, Matt and Emmy. Yeah, it's been fun.
It's fun.
And come back again for the next one. Anytime. You're always welcome.
Right on.
Thanks.
All right. We're out.
See ya.